The lanterns in the stable cast long, trembling shadows across the rows of stalls, flickering against the sleek hides of the horses that pawed at the straw. Marcus moved quietly among them, hands steady, eyes sharp, noting every movement, every sound of the master and his overseers. To the world, he was a strong, fat, stable slave, compliant, obedient, and perhaps a little slow-witted. But beneath the surface simmered a mind, patient, intelligent, and deliberate. A mind that had spent years observing cruelty, memorizing habits, and plotting an inevitable reckoning. This is the story of how one enslaved man turned his master's greatest pride, his horses, into the instruments of vengeance. Before we journey deeper into the swampy depths of Louisiana and the dark corridors of the Thibodeau estate, tell me, where are you watching from tonight? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment, and if stories of patience, intelligence, and calculated justice pull you in, hit subscribe, because what you are about to hear has been hidden in the shadows of history for decades. Marcus had arrived at the Thibodeau estate in 1821, a young man of immense physical strength and quiet intelligence. His large frame and calm demeanor made him a figure easily underestimated by the master and overseers, who saw him as obedient and harmless. From the moment he entered the estate, Marcus began observing, studying the rhythms of the household, the habits of the master, and the predictable routines that governed both human and animal alike. Every gesture, every order, every small act of cruelty by Master Thibodeau was noted and stored in his memory, building a catalog of vulnerabilities he could exploit years later. Master Thibodeau was a man who wielded power through fear and intimidation. He took pleasure in asserting dominance, often using his horses as instruments of control. Whips cracked across their flanks when a servant faltered, and the loud clatter of hooves became a soundtrack for the terror he imposed. Marcus, however, had learned to read beyond the surface of this authority. He recognized that while strength and intimidation could command obedience, they were predictable and, therefore, exploitable. Patience, observation, and subtlety were the true instruments of power. The stable became Marcus's laboratory for understanding control and influence. He learned every horse's temperament, every stall's layout, and every gate's weakness. He noted when the master preferred to inspect the animals, how he responded to disobedience, and the patterns that governed the estate's daily operations. Each moment of observation reinforced his understanding that true power lay not in confrontation, but in the patient accumulation of knowledge. The seemingly mundane, the positioning of a rope, the placement of a harness, the timing of feeding, was being transformed into the architecture of future revenge. Other enslaved workers took notice of Marcus's quiet intelligence, though they underestimated its depth. They observed the way he moved among the animals with precision, how he navigated the master's scrutiny without raising suspicion, and how his calm presence seemed to absorb tension in the room. Some offered tacit support, slight delays in chores, a glance conveying understanding, but none suspected the full scope of his long-term design. Marcus's patience created a silent network of complicity, where observation and quiet cooperation amplified the eventual impact of his plans. The master's arrogance worked in Marcus's favor. Thibodeau assumed that obedience equated to submission, and that any figure of strength who smiled and complied posed no threat. Marcus capitalized on this misjudgment, cultivating a reputation of harmlessness while cataloging weaknesses: a gate that creaked, a stable door that never locked fully, a pattern in which guards were inattentive. Even small distractions or inconsistencies in the master's routines were logged meticulously, providing potential tools for the future. Daily life on the estate demanded physical labor, but Marcus treated it as rehearsal. The loading of hay, the leading of horses to water, the cleaning of stalls all became opportunities to test and refine his understanding of timing, leverage, and human behavior. Each interaction with the master, overseers, or fellow slaves added data points to the mental map that would guide the precise execution of his long-awaited vengeance. He learned to be seen but not noticed, to be present yet invisible, a paradox that would define the inevitability of his plan. Even the animals played a role in his mental preparation. Marcus studied the horses not only for their temperaments but also for the ways their obedience could be directed subtly. He began testing routes through the surrounding swamp, noting the depth of water, hidden channels, and areas where escape would be difficult. These early observations were catalogued for a night decades away, when the swamp would become the stage for his carefully orchestrated justice. By nightfall, as lanterns flickered and the estate fell into routine, Marcus returned to the stable quietly, his mind active with the sequences he had memorized over years of observation. The master's arrogance, the predictable behaviors of the overseers, and the silent complicity of the enslaved workers were all threads woven into a tapestry of eventual reckoning. Marcus understood that impatience or impulsive action could ruin everything. Only a calculated, deliberate strategy executed at the precise moment would yield the justice he sought. The Thibodeau estate, on the surface orderly and controlled, was quietly being transformed into a stage upon which patience, intelligence, and subtle manipulation would overturn the hierarchy, leaving the master at the mercy of the very instruments he had once wielded to control others. Marcus, the quiet, observant, stable slave, was poised at the threshold of inevitability, prepared to convert decades of endurance and observation into action that would be precise, deliberate, and unforgettable. The Louisiana sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden haze over the sprawling Thibodeau estate, as Marcus continued the quiet work that had occupied him for years. To the casual observer, he remained the same fat, obedient, stable slave, his movements deliberate but unremarkable, his presence seemingly harmless. Yet beneath that exterior, Marcus's mind was a careful repository of observation, analysis, and strategy. Each day of servitude, each punishment endured, each insult catalogued and filed with meticulous care. He had learned that patience was a weapon far more powerful than brute strength or quick retaliation. The reckoning he envisioned would not be impulsive. It would be inevitable, calculated, and precise. Marcus began refining his knowledge of the estate and its surroundings. He mapped the stables, noting which gates were weak, which locks were loose, and which routes through the swamp could support a controlled escape or a trap. Horses, once instruments of his master's dominance, became components of a grand plan. Marcus studied each animal's temperament, its speed, obedience, and reactions under stress. Over years, he imagined the choreography, the animal's movements, the reactions of his master, and the precise timing needed to ensure every detail unfolded flawlessly. Every pattern in the master's routine, every predictable glance or pause, was a note in the symphony he was silently composing. Other enslaved workers began to recognize Marcus's keen intellect, though none could comprehend the full scope of his patience. They noticed how he anticipated the master's movements, how he subtly redirected the horses, and how he navigated every hall and corridor without a trace of misstep. Some offered small, unspoken assistance. A delay in a chore, a misplacement of an object, a glance that conveyed silent acknowledgement. Their compliance was voluntary yet necessary, a network of quiet complicity that amplified the inevitability of the plan. The beauty of Marcus's strategy lay in its subtlety. No one would see the culmination coming until it was already too late. Patience was also psychological. Marcus studied the master's weaknesses with a scholar's rigor. He observed how Thibodeau's arrogance blinded him, how he relied on routine and predictable behaviors, and how he underestimated those he considered physically or intellectually inferior. Every scornful glance, every dismissive word, and every act of cruelty added fuel to Marcus's understanding of how to manipulate the environment and the people within it. He understood that true power was not seized in moments of anger but cultivated over time, using intelligence, observation, and strategic subtlety. Marcus also began collecting tools, not for immediate use but for the moment when his patience would finally bear fruit. Ropes, harnesses, and hidden implements were quietly stored in places no overseer would inspect. Each item was catalogued mentally, a part of the careful choreography he had envisioned for decades. Even the ordinary candlesticks, feeding buckets, and stall doors was analyzed for potential utility. Nothing was wasted. Everything had a role to play in the night that would alter the dynamics of the estate forever. The stable itself became a classroom. Marcus learned the horses' reactions to commands, their limits, and their obedience. He experimented subtly, misdirecting them slightly during routine work to test responsiveness, studying their reactions without alerting the overseers or his master. Every animal was both a companion and a tool, each capable of executing precisely the actions Marcus would later need to achieve his goal. Patience was tested daily. Impulsive action could ruin everything, and he understood that fully. During meals and gatherings, Marcus maintained the appearance of compliance. He smiled, bowed, and carried trays with care, all the while observing patterns in the master's attention, the placement of guests, and the timing of inspections. The household itself became a living map, each corner, corridor, and passage memorized and analyzed for strategic advantage. His mental archive of weaknesses, opportunities, and environmental leverage grew daily, forming a blueprint for the inevitable night when all patience, intelligence, and observation would converge. Psychological manipulation continued quietly. Marcus used small disruptions to test responses. A misplaced tool, a subtly delayed feed, a stall door left slightly ajar. The master's confidence remained intact, but small moments of unease began to emerge, perceptible only to those attuned to subtle patterns. These minor tests were rehearsals for the night of retribution, ensuring that every detail had been accounted for and every reaction anticipated. By nightfall, Marcus retired to his small quarters in the corner of the stable, a quiet sanctuary for reflection and planning. The day's observations were catalogued, and potential contingencies were rehearsed mentally. Years of endurance, intelligence, and careful observation had brought him closer to the night when control would shift, when the seemingly harmless stable slave would wield patience as a weapon, and when the master who had long relied on brute strength would discover that intellect, foresight, and meticulous planning could overturn tyranny entirely. As the moon rose over the swamps surrounding the Thibodeau estate, Marcus's patience solidified into certainty. The tools, the observations, the network of silent allies, and the carefully studied horses were all in place. The moment of reckoning was still years away, but the architecture of inevitability had been established. Every day of obedience, every slight manipulation, and every catalogued cruelty had been folded into a plan that would not fail. The estate, confident in its unyielding hierarchy, remained blissfully unaware that one patient, intelligent, and deliberate man had quietly prepared to invert its power forever. By the mid-1820s, Marcus had become a figure of quiet authority among the enslaved workers of the Thibodeau estate. His physical presence alone was imposing, but it was his mind, patient, methodical, and strategic, that earned him a reputation that subtly spread through the quarters. Other enslaved people recognized his intelligence, though none fully comprehended the scope of his long-term plan. Some offered tacit assistance, a glance that conveyed understanding, a deliberate pause in a chore, or minor misdirections during the master's inspections. Each act, small as it seemed, became part of a silent, collective strategy designed to strengthen Marcus's eventual execution of justice. This network of quiet allies was critical. The success of his plan depended not only on his observation and patience, but also on the cooperation, however subtle, of those around him. Marcus began to assemble the tangible tools required for the act he had envisioned. Rope, strong and supple, was quietly stashed in corners of the stable. Harnesses were subtly adjusted to suit the future scenario he had rehearsed mentally for years. He memorized every structural weakness in the estate, loose boards in the stables, the precise swing of the gate leading to the swamp, the narrow paths through the waterlogged terrain surrounding the property. Even the horses themselves were studied meticulously, their reactions, temperaments, and stamina catalogued so that Marcus could direct them as instruments of calculated vengeance. Each item, each animal, and each route had been converted into a component of a precise and inevitable orchestration. The psychological dynamics of the household were equally important. Marcus understood that the master, arrogant and accustomed to unchallenged authority, would not perceive the subtle manipulations that had quietly shifted the balance of power. He noted the blind spots in Thibodeau's vigilance, the predictable moments of distraction, and the precise ways the overseers deferred to the master's ego. By understanding these vulnerabilities, Marcus ensured that no immediate suspicion would fall on him or his allies when the time came to execute his plan. Marcus continued refining his mental map of the estate. Every stall, every gate, every corridor was measured, not only physically, but strategically. He calculated the timing of daily routines, the duration of meals, the rhythm of chores, and the intervals during which the master and overseers were distracted. He visualized every movement of the household, integrating minor interventions, misplaced tools, subtly delayed tasks, and small diversions into a choreography that would guide the night of reckoning. Nothing was left to chance. Every detail was accounted for with the precision of a seasoned strategist. The enslaved allies he had quietly cultivated played subtle but essential roles. They were aware of the stakes and understood the importance of patience and silence. Their cooperation was unspoken. A deliberate glance or a minor adjustment in a routine task could amplify the effectiveness of Marcus's plan. They became instruments of inevitability, their actions aligning seamlessly with Marcus's vision. Even the smallest gestures, a door left slightly ajar, a tray subtly misaligned, or the soft guidance of a horse were part of a larger architecture of control that the master would never detect until it was too late. Marcus also prepared for contingencies, recognizing that even the most carefully executed plan could encounter unexpected obstacles. Alternate routes through the swamp were memorized, backup locations for stashing tools were identified, and the horse's movements were rehearsed repeatedly in his mind. Every possible variable, weather, overseer attention, the reactions of other enslaved workers, was accounted for in meticulous detail. Years of observation had taught him that unpredictability could only be mitigated through preparation, and Marcus left nothing to chance. Over time, Marcus became invisible in plain sight. The master and overseers continued to regard him as fat, obedient, and harmless, oblivious to the intellect, patience, and strategic foresight that lay beneath the surface. This invisibility was not passive. It was cultivated deliberately, an essential component of his power. The household's trust in his harmlessness ensured that he could move freely, gather tools, and coordinate his allies without arousing suspicion. Every day of obedience, every act of quiet observation, and every subtle manipulation was a brick in the foundation of his inevitable vengeance. By the late afternoon, the estate hummed with routine, yet beneath the polished floors and tidy stables, the instruments of calculated justice were silently arrayed. Rope, harnesses, and the strategically studied horses waited in readiness. Allies, aware but discreet, moved through their routines with deliberate caution. And Marcus, standing among the animals he had studied for years, felt the inevitability of his plan solidify. The stage had been set, the participants aligned, and the architecture of patient, intelligent revenge was nearing the moment when it would transform from thought into action. The swamp beyond the estate, murky and unyielding, had been mapped in Marcus's mind with obsessive precision. He knew its depths, its hidden channels, and the areas where horses could move with force and control. Each feature of the terrain had been rehearsed mentally thousands of times. One day soon, it would be the stage upon which the master's arrogance and cruelty would be reversed, transformed into a spectacle of justice executed with precision, intelligence, and patient inevitability. Marcus's patience, cultivated over decades, had now become a tangible weapon, and the final act of his careful orchestration was closer than ever. By the early 1830s, Marcus had become not only the most trusted figure among the horses and stables, but also an invisible authority within the Thibodeau household. Outwardly, he remained the fat, quiet, stable slave, overlooked and underestimated by the master and overseers alike. Yet beneath the surface, every routine, every object, every behavior was being carefully manipulated to prepare for the eventual night of reckoning. What appeared to be compliance was in fact the artful orchestration of subtle sabotage, a patient reshaping of the household dynamics that would culminate in complete control over the master's fate. Marcus began increasing the minor disruptions he had experimented with over the previous decade. He misaligned harnesses and bridles, not enough to alert suspicion but sufficient to create small delays. He guided the horses ever so slightly off their usual routes during daily exercises, observing how the animals responded and taking note of the precise adjustments necessary for the night that would come. The timing of feedings and the arrangement of stalls were altered strategically. A gate left unsecured for just a moment, a door slightly ajar, a stall door that squeaked only under specific pressure, all were subtle instruments of his growing influence over the estate. Psychological tension within the household was cultivated carefully. Marcus noticed that Master Thibodeau's arrogance made him predictable and vulnerable. The master trusted his perception and overlooked the intelligence of those he deemed inferior. Marcus exploited this perception, ensuring that the master interpreted every minor disruption as coincidence or as the incompetence of others, never as a deliberate orchestration. Each moment of confusion, each unexpected hiccup, added to a quiet anxiety that would magnify during the final act of vengeance. Allies among the enslaved workers were crucial in this stage of preparation. They observed Marcus's subtle cues and participated in silent, carefully timed acts, moving objects to delay the master, misdirecting horses without drawing notice, or performing tasks with deliberate errors that seemed innocuous. These allies, though unspoken in agreement, became active participants in the web of subtle sabotage, reinforcing the inevitability of the plan. Every quiet action strengthened Marcus's control while keeping suspicion at bay. Even the horses themselves were manipulated with precision. Marcus had spent years memorizing each animal's temperament, obedience, and reaction under duress. During routine exercises, he tested their responsiveness, observing their reactions to minor deviations in routine or subtle redirections. Every adjustment, no matter how small, was rehearsed mentally thousands of times, ensuring that the animals would respond predictably when the decisive moment arrived. The horses were no longer merely beasts of burden. They had become instruments of strategy. The master remained blissfully unaware of the changes in his household. Each disruption, misplacement, and delay was interpreted as randomness or minor incompetence. He continued to enforce his authority with the same cruelty and arrogance, never recognizing the quiet transformation unfolding beneath his notice. Marcus's patience and intelligence had created an invisible lattice of control. The master's confidence, ironically, reinforced the effectiveness of the subtle sabotage that would ultimately lead to his downfall. By nightfall, the house was a stage meticulously prepared for the eventual act. Candles flickered in the halls, casting shadows that obscured the careful arrangements Marcus had implemented. Minor misalignments, slightly delayed feedings, and strategically shifted objects ensured that every element of the household's routine would serve the purpose of the inevitable retribution. The enslaved workers carried out their tasks with deliberate calm, reinforcing the illusion of order while silently participating in the orchestration of the master's eventual fate. Marcus himself moved through the stables and corridors with an almost meditative precision. Every glance, every adjustment, every silent gesture was part of the architecture of inevitability. He monitored the animals, observed the household staff, and recorded every minor anomaly, ensuring that no variable would disrupt the delicate balance he had spent decades constructing. The timing of the eventual act had been rehearsed in his mind countless times, and each evening of subtle sabotage brought the moment of reckoning closer. The swamp beyond the estate loomed silently, a natural barrier and a hidden theater for Marcus's long-prepared justice. He had mapped its depths, channels, and hidden paths with painstaking care, rehearsing in his mind the controlled movement of the horses and the positioning of the master. The swamp, which had once been a feature of the landscape ignored by the master, would soon become the stage upon which decades of patience, observation, and subtle sabotage converged into action. By the end of the evening, Marcus retired to his quarters, quiet and unnoticed, reflecting on the web of subtle manipulations he had woven. The estate seemed unchanged to outsiders, yet beneath its polished surface, the hierarchy and dynamics had shifted imperceptibly. The master, confident in his authority, remained oblivious to the silent force that had been patiently reshaping his household for years. Marcus's patient sabotage ensured that the eventual execution of his plan would unfold with precision, inevitability, and the cold intelligence of a mind that had waited decades to strike. The night had settled over the Thibodeau estate like a thick, oppressive blanket, the swampy air heavy with humidity and the scent of decaying leaves. Lanterns flickered along the stables, casting wavering shadows that danced across the stalls. Marcus moved silently among the horses, his large frame careful, deliberate, and poised. Decades of observation, patience, and subtle sabotage had led to this very night, the culmination of 20 years of endurance and strategic intelligence. Every detail had been rehearsed, every horse trained mentally to respond at the precise moment, every ally in the shadows poised for silent complicity. Master Thibodeau, oblivious to the web of control being woven around him, retired late, confident that his authority was absolute and unquestioned. He had no reason to suspect that the very animals he so proudly commanded would be instruments of his undoing. The master's arrogance blinded him to Marcus's intelligence. The quiet, fat stable slave had long been underestimated. Tonight, the predictable behaviors of both man and beast would converge to create an outcome both precise and inescapable. Marcus moved first through the stables, checking ropes, harnesses, and gates, ensuring everything was aligned with the plan. Each horse was led calmly, its strength and obedience harnessed in preparation for the critical moment. He adjusted bridles and shifted weight subtly, ensuring that the animals would follow the exact paths he had mapped through the swamp. Years of patient observation had made this sequence as natural to him as breathing every movement calculated, deliberate, and rehearsed. Other enslaved workers played their parts silently. A stable hand left a gate slightly ajar. Another whispered a necessary cue. A third diverted the overseer's attention at the right moment. No one intervened directly, yet their tacit complicity ensured that the orchestration of the night would be flawless. Silence, awareness, and subtle intervention were the instruments that amplified Marcus's strategy, allowing him to maintain control without alerting the master. The master's final steps were predictable. Lured by Marcus's careful guidance, he followed the path through the stables toward the horses, unaware that every element of the environment had been manipulated. The ropes were positioned, the animals ready, the terrain memorized and accounted for. Marcus's patience, accumulated over decades, had ensured that the master's arrogance and predictable behavior would be used against him with precision. At the critical moment, the horses surged forward, directed expertly by Marcus's control of their movements. The master, tied as planned, could not resist or escape. Panic rippled through him. But every reaction had been anticipated, every possibility calculated. The swamp, previously a silent landscape, became the theater of justice, its murky waters hiding every misstep and ensuring that the execution of vengeance would be complete. Marcus maintained a calm, deliberate presence, guiding the animals and ensuring the sequence unfolded flawlessly. The enslaved witnesses remained in the shadows, observing silently, ensuring no interference from overseers or unintended participants. Their silence was a powerful tool, reinforcing the inevitability of justice without compromising the plan. Marcus's intelligence and patience had created a system in which every participant, active or passive, contributed to the precise execution of vengeance. The night's events were both a demonstration of power and an assertion of earned justice. By the time the first light of dawn crept over the swamp, the master had been delivered to his final resting place. His arrogance and cruelty undone by the intelligence, patience, and meticulous planning of the man he had dismissed as harmless. Marcus moved through the aftermath with the same quiet efficiency that had defined his entire approach, ensuring the horses were tended, evidence minimized, and nothing traceable remained to incriminate him. The swamp absorbed the event silently, hiding the culmination of decades of calculated endurance. The neighboring plantation owners would later speak in hushed tones of the Thibodeau disappearance. Rumors circulated, weaving fear and speculation, but the precise nature of Marcus's patience and execution remained hidden. The intelligence, observation, and careful orchestration that had brought about the master's downfall were invisible to all but those who had quietly assisted. The night was a testament to the power of long-term planning, patience, and calculated action, demonstrating that subtlety and intelligence could overturn brute force and cruelty with finality. Marcus's patient orchestration had proven that long-suppressed intelligence, honed over decades, could convert obedience into strategy and observation into a weapon. The estate itself, once a symbol of unchecked power, had become a stage for the inevitable justice Marcus had carefully cultivated. By nightfall, the swamp had claimed both the arrogance and cruelty of the master, leaving behind a landscape of silent awe, whispered fear, and the undeniable demonstration that patience, intelligence, and careful planning were more powerful than tyranny. Dawn broke over the Louisiana swamp with an eerie quiet, as if nature itself paused to acknowledge the culmination of Marcus's patient orchestration. The Thibodeau estate lay in an uncanny stillness. Birds hesitated in their morning flight, insects moved sluggishly through the damp undergrowth, and the horses Marcus had trained for this precise purpose grazed silently, oblivious to the enormity of what had transpired. To the casual observer, the estate appeared unchanged except for the absence of the master, whose arrogance and cruelty had been extinguished by the very instruments he had once wielded to command fear. Marcus moved through the stables with measured calm, ensuring that the animals were unharmed and that all signs of deliberate action were minimized. His long-planned orchestration had succeeded with exacting precision, and yet, as always, his intelligence dictated that no trace should remain to incriminate him. Every rope, every misaligned bridle, every subtle manipulation had been restored or removed. The swamp had absorbed its secrets, holding them like a silent guardian. The other enslaved workers, quietly aware of the execution and its inevitability, returned to their duties, their eyes carrying unspoken understanding and respect. The network of silent complicity had preserved them all. Word of the master's disappearance began to circulate among neighboring plantations. Whispers spoke of a fatal accident, a mysterious misfortune, or perhaps divine retribution. The details of Marcus's patient, calculated execution were never shared openly, but the aura of fear and uncertainty spread quickly. Overseers questioned routine procedures, neighbors double-checked their gates, and even the bravest masters reconsidered how much control could truly be exercised over the lives of those they enslaved. Marcus's patience, intelligence, and careful planning had created not only immediate justice but a long-lasting ripple of psychological influence across the region. In the quarters, the enslaved community absorbed the story with reverent silence. Marcus's triumph became legend not merely as the act of vengeance, but as the embodiment of calculated endurance and strategic intellect. Tales of the quiet, stable slave who had manipulated time, animals, and human behavior over decades circulated in whispers, emphasizing the potency of patience and careful observation. Children learned of the power that intelligence and strategy could wield, and adults were reminded that subtle, invisible influence could overturn even the most entrenched tyranny. Marcus himself vanished soon after, taking on a new identity and moving through neighboring plantations and towns. His disappearance was unremarkable. A man of his size and appearance could easily blend into other estates, yet the precision with which he had executed his plan ensured that the fear and respect his actions commanded would follow him invisibly. Those who had assisted him quietly continued their lives, carrying with them the lessons of patient compliance, strategic observation, and the devastating effectiveness of deliberate action. The master's fate, meticulously orchestrated, had become a symbol of justice achieved through intellect rather than brute force. The swamp, which had served as both instrument and stage, remained a quiet sentinel over the estate, its murky waters hiding the full extent of Marcus's orchestration. Nature, in its indifferent way, preserved the memory of the night, while the community of enslaved workers carried forward the moral and strategic lessons embedded in his patient orchestration. The act had not been impulsive. It had been inevitable, earned, and precise, a calculated statement against cruelty, arrogance, and tyranny. Decades later, Marcus's name lived on as legend, whispered in hushed tones, the silent, stable slave who led his master into the swamp with patience, intelligence, and the unerring precision of someone who had endured decades of cruelty without surrendering to impulsive anger. His story became a testament to the power of observation, patience, and careful planning, the proof that even those deemed powerless could wield influence, exact justice, and leave a legacy that persisted far beyond the immediate act. The estate continued its routines superficially, but the psychological impact remained embedded. Overseers were cautious, masters wary, and the enslaved more observant. The story of Marcus, though cloaked in secrecy, demonstrated the enduring strength of intelligence over force, patience over impulsivity, and strategy over brute dominance. The swamp kept its secrets, the horses returned to their stalls, and Marcus's legacy, like the quiet ripple of water through the reeds, extended beyond the bounds of the estate and into the fabric of whispered history. In every corner of the estate and beyond, the lesson endured. Patience, intelligence, and deliberate action could overturn tyranny, create inevitability, and reshape the balance of power. Marcus had not merely exacted revenge. He had authored a timeless lesson in strategy, observation, and the quiet but unstoppable force of the human mind.